Hello, today we'll be talking about the effects of chronic stress on the digestive system. So, the digestive system is also known as the gastrointestinal system. The GI tract is a series of hollow organs joined together in this long twisting tube. And the main organs that make up the digestive system is the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, also the rectum and the anus. And it also consists of some solid accessory organs, such as the salivary glands, the pancreas, and the liver, and the gallbladder as well. And these organs are not part of the digestive tract, but they play a significant role in the digestive activities. Now, the digestive system fulfills two of the basic and essential requirements for being alive, which is absorption of food intake and elimination of waste products. There are many stages in food processing. You have ingestion. The mouth breaks up the food particles and moves it along through the digestive tract. Um, now, the exocrine and the endocrine function secretes enzymes to assist in digestion and break down food into nutrients that the body can absorb and use while eliminating waste products as well. And another function of the digestive system is the immune barrier. The lining of the intestine forms a barrier for protection against any microbes that can potentially be harmful to us. And the digestive system works very closely with the circulatory system. The nutrients that are obtained from food passes into the circulatory system and taken to where it's needed in the body. And the circulatory system also carries chemical signals from the endocrine system that controls the speed of digestion. It also works alongside the excretory system to filter out any compounds from the bloodstream and collect them in urine. And this help maintains chemical homeostasis in our body. It's also connected to the nervous system. The tone of the digestive tract is controlled by the ANS, and the brain controls drinking and feeding behaviors. The gastrointestinal system also has its own nervous system, which is called the enteric nervous system, which is embedded in the lining of our gastrointestinal system and operates independently from the brain and the spinal cord. Also, the digestive system houses 70% of the immune system, and our health is dependent upon the complex and diversified microbacteria that's in our gut. So, stress ultimately affects our immune system, which in turn affects our digestive system. And now we'll go into the consequences of stress on the digestive system in the next slide.
Hi, my name is Christal, and today I'll be talking about the physiological consequences of chronic stress on the digestive system. Major life stressors that are either acute or chronic trigger the fight or flight response. Over time, chronic stress can have a major effect on the body, especially the gut. Gut motility and secretion are examples of physiological functions that are important to gut health. Stress can cause these important functions to have physiological consequences. Gut microbiota can also be modified by stress. BGA, also known as brain-gut axis, is the connection containing systems such as the ANS, which is short for autonomic nervous system, and HPA, which is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Microbiota and BGA communicate through endocrine message, immune message, and neuronal message. If stress can modify microbiota, it can make changes to pro-inflammatory cytokine levels. Changes in the brain-gut microbiota axis can cause irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. When the brain-gut microbiota is activated, the sensitivity of the inner organs and release of gastrointestinal hormones and neurotransmitters change, as well as the pro-inflammatory cytokines, gastrointestinal motility, and gut microbiota. Corticotrophin releasing factor, or CRF, is needed to coordinate the endocrine, behavioral, and immune response relating to stress. CRF can be seen in the central nervous system and also inside the gut. CRF is responsible for increasing gut permeability, modulation of inflammation, gut motility, and the sensitivity of the inner organs, or it's called visceral hypersensitivity. The endocrine response system to stress activates when CRF is present in the hypothalamus. On the other hand, hormones such as adrenocorticotropic or ACTH are needed to be dispersed in order to make the adrenal gland's secretion of the stress hormone cortisol to work. Recent studies have determined that gut microbiota, the immune system, and also the brain-gut axis are all connected to one another when it comes to the stress response of the gut.
Irritable bowel syndrome, also known as IBS, is a disorder in the gastrointestinal system. There have been no conclusions made about the underlying conditions of why the changes of frequency and formation of stool is connected to this recurring abdominal pain. In Western countries, this disorder mainly affects adults, more specifically women. IBS is commonly detected when constipation, bloating, abdominal pain, and diarrhea occurs. Subtypes of IBS, such as IBS-D, IBS-C, IBS-A, and IBS-U, are all based on irritable bowel syndrome. IBS-D is identified when diarrhea is most prominent. IBS-C is identified when an individual is mainly constipated. IBS-A is identified when there is a change in the forms of stool. IBS-U is the unsubtyped and is most commonly distributed evenly in the affected individuals of IBS. In the pictures shown at the right, the body on the left is the one that has a normal digestive system. On the right of the picture, we see a body with a hand holding the large intestine. This is to show that when someone has IBS, there are ruptures in the large intestine that causes pain, diarrhea, and irregular stool.
Symptoms that are commonly experienced in irritable bowel syndrome include pain and cramping, diarrhea and constipation, changes in bowel movements, food intolerance, fatigue and difficulty sleeping, and anxiety and depression. Abdominal pain is the most common symptom and a key factor in the diagnosis of IBS, while constipation itself is one of the main factors responsible for chronic recurring abdominal pain. In addition, over half of people with IBS report experiencing fatigue, and up to 70% of diagnosed individuals report that particular foods trigger symptoms, although the cause of these food triggers remains unclear. IBS is linked to cognitive conditions as well. Anxiety and digestive IBS symptoms appear to reinforce one another in a vicious cycle, while people with IBS are reportedly more likely to have an anxiety disorder or mood disorder, such as depression. The pathophysiology of IBS remains poorly understood, but there are a number of key factors which may play a critical role in the symptom expression of a person diagnosed with IBS, including but not limited to intestinal hyperpermeability, intestinal inflammation, and weight loss. Intestinal permeability refers to how easily substances pass through the intestinal wall. The intestinal barrier prevents loss of water, electrolytes, and the entry of antigens and microorganisms into the body, while allowing the exchange of molecules between host and environment and the absorption of nutrients in the diet. When the tight junctions of intestinal walls become loose, the gut becomes more permeable, which may allow bacteria and toxins to pass from the gut into the bloodstream. A broad range of pathologies can lead to intestinal inflammation, including IBS. Recent studies have suggested that there may be genetic risk factors for altered immunologic function in patients diagnosed with IBS. In addition, a single nucleotide polymorphism in the tumor necrosis factor gene encodes for a higher production of pro-inflammatory cytokines and appears to be more frequent in patients with IBS. This overproduction of pro-inflammatory cytokines is likely to be a direct cause of gut inflammation. Weight loss comes from inflammatory diseases, because gut inflammation can make the act of digesting food painful, in addition to hindering the absorption of nutrients in the intestines. Inflammation can also impact the efficacy of the intestinal mucosal barrier, which is necessary for digestion, because it becomes functionally damaged through physical distortion. In terms of cellular mechanisms, the cell membranes in intestinal cilia become too thin, leaky, and less effective in transporting molecules.
As noted, both physiological and psychological stress is an important factor for the development of the irritable bowel symptoms, shortened as IBS, due to the overactivity of the gut being triggered. So over here, taking a look at the physiological effect of stress on IBS. On this slide, since stress can arise from perceived or actual event that will disturb the body balance, chronic stress experienced in life through neurogenic stressors can be involved in physical simulations such as infection, body injury, going through surgery, and unbalanced diet. And this can have an impact on the IBS symptoms. So this will later lead to physical symptoms such as aches, pain, diarrhea, or constipation. And more of the symptoms and their signs will be mentioned later. Taking a look at this slide, we will look at the psychological effect of stress on IBS. So simulation of psychological effect of chronic stress on IBS can be triggered by the mental health problems like anxiety, depression, insomnia, or high blood pressure. And this can lead to the trigger of other symptoms such as upset stomach, dizziness, irritability, or etc. So evidence from clinical and experimental study have demonstrated that psychological stress has a significant impact on the intestinal sensitivity, mobility, secretion, and permeability, along with the close correlation pointing toward the mucosal immune activation. So although psychological stress can trigger anxiety, it does not cause the digestive disorder itself. So rather, IBS is actually quite stress sensitive. Therefore, IBS caused by stress will initially flare up. So studies has also demonstrated that early adverse life events are associated with the prevalence of IBS, such as traumatic experience that is experienced during childhood, for instance events like maladjusted relationships or the death of a loved one. A mention of the brain-gut axis in the slides before, but a link formed between the psychological stress and IBS will originate from the brain-gut axis. So the brain of the nervous system will communicate with the gut system, also called the enteric nervous system. In this case, the enteric nervous system will play a crucial role in the regulation of the gut physiology, such as secretion, mobility, along with the release of various neuropeptides and hormones.
Hi. So, as we stated earlier, IBS is a chronic intestinal disorder primarily physiologically characterized by mucosal inflammation of the bowel. So what's been found is that most inflammatory bowel syndromes are caused from a common disease, which is mucosal barrier dysfunction. And so we'll find mucosal barrier dysfunction being incited by things like allergies, infections, liver diseases, and it's tied to IBS, inflammatory bowel syndrome, and celiac disease. So MBD, mucosal barrier dysfunction, in the small intestine weakens protective chemical barriers like antimicrobial peptides, reg-3 proteins, lysozyme, and phospholipases. They're all hindered, which loosens the protection of the membrane and further allows either inflammation or potentially allows local bacteria to seep through those inner mucosal layers and cause infection. In the large intestine, those chemical barriers are a lot less prevalent, and it's mostly up to physical barriers like the mucous membrane itself, the glycocalyx on microvilli, and cell junctions linking IECs to protect against microbial infection and membrane degradation. What this all accounts to is that the main barrier in the large intestine is mostly mucous membrane, and the inflammation and destruction of that, in the case of an exacerbated stress response, is exactly why we see most inflammatory bowel diseases show their symptoms prominently in the large intestine. So IBS has a genetic component which makes you more predisposed to developing it. However, it is exacerbated by that long-term stress response, and some evidence strongly suggests that gut environmental factors and host immune dysregulation contribute to the occurrence and development of those inflammatory diseases. So as this pertains to chronic stress, we found research that designed a study which examines mucosal barrier dysfunction as a mechanism for increased susceptibility to IBS and others. So there are two sets of rats, one wild type and one mast cell deficient type. And they were subjected to stress tests, and essentially the rats with the mast cell dysfunction or lack of them did not show chronic stress responses as pertains to inflammation. So what we found was that lack of mast cells in rats significantly dampens the chronic stress response by stopping the pathway of systemic inflammation started by that response. So the mast cell deficient rats also did not show goblet cell depletion that were present in the wild type rats, which tells us that the chronic stress response not only causes that bowel inflammation, but it depletes the mucosal membranes by damaging and stopping the goblet cell's secretion of mucus. And it uses this, and it starts all of this through that long-term stress response, which initiates corticotropin-releasing hormone, which eventually binds to the CRH receptors on mast cells, activating them, causing the systemic inflammation. Thanks.
The digestive system, which is also called the gastrointestinal system, is linked to the works with multiple systems throughout the body, including the circulatory system and the nervous system. Its function is to ingest food, break it down, absorb it for nutrition, and finally discard leftover waste. We mentioned how gut motility and secretion are examples of physiological functions that are important to gut health and how stress can cause these important functions to degrade. We found that one of the main physiological consequences of stress on the digestive system was irritable bowel syndrome, which led us to dive deeper into the cellular mechanisms and signs and symptoms of IBS. Some of the symptoms of IBS include abdominal pain, cramping, diarrhea, and irregularity in stool. We've explored how chronic stress activates a cascade sequence of corticotropin-releasing hormone binding to mast cells, thus activating them and causing inflammation. Although there are no finalized conclusions made on the connections between chronic stress and IBS, multiple studies have been tested and results have shown that they are possibly connected, and we've learned that a chronic stress response will exacerbate symptoms of IBS by multiplying already present inflammation. IBS does not have a cure. However, there are several treatments that can help reduce the symptoms, such as eating a proper diet, using peppermint oil, taking prescribed medications, exercising, being hydrated, cognitive behavior therapy, and hypnotherapy. Thank you.